midway breakdown. Cutting through the spin. Exposing the truth. Liberty Ledger.
The air in the Senate Judiciary Committee room felt heavy, like the moments right before a thunderstorm breaks. Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table, her fingers tracing the edge of her notes, ready to speak about the weight of being a Muslim woman in the halls of power. But 15 feet away, Senator Ted Cruz was already moving. He didn't look like a politician making a speech. He looked like a prosecutor who had just closed the exit doors. He adjusted his glasses, opened a thin red folder, and with a voice as steady as a heartbeat, he began to dismantle a decade of carefully curated silence. Cruz didn't start with an accusation. He started with a projection. A screen behind him flickered to life, showing a tweet from 2012 that had lived in the digital shadows for years. "Israel has hypnotized the world," it read. Omar's grip on her pen tightened as the words hung there in stark white text. She had come to talk about Islamophobia, but Cruz was shifting the tectonic plates of the conversation. He asked her a simple, bone-chilling question. "Do you stand by those words?" The room went deathly still, the only sound being the frantic clicking of reporters' keyboards as they realized the script for the day had been shredded. As Omar tried to pivot, mentioning her age at the time, Cruz was already reaching for the next piece of evidence. He spoke of ancient, blood-soaked tropes and the historical scars of the Jewish people, his tone shifting from a lawyer to a professor. He laid out documents like a poker player revealing a royal flush, moving from the hypnotized tweet to the infamous "It is all about the Benjamins" comment. He held up color-coded charts, showing that while major industries spent hundreds of millions on lobbying, Omar had uniquely targeted the Jewish lobby. Why her? Why only them? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that demands an answer that isn't coming. The tension reached a breaking point when the topic shifted to the sacred ground of American grief. The screen remained blank, as Cruz recited words from memory that felt like a physical blow. Some people did something. He held up a photograph of the Twin Towers, the sky choked with ash, and the windows filled with the desperate. He spoke for Nicholas Harosger, a man whose mother never came home from the South Tower, and who had to watch a sitting congresswoman minimize the slaughter of 3,000 souls as a mere occurrence. Omar's eyes welled with tears, but the senator wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for a clarity she seemed unable to provide. As the clock ticked down, Cruz delivered the final, inescapable choice. He asked if Israel had a right to exist as a Jewish state. It was a binary, a line in the sand, with no room for the safe, polished rhetoric of a career politician. Omar looked at her hands, at her staff, at the cameras that were broadcasting her hesitation to 50 million people. She spoke of two-state solutions and equal rights, but she never said the word yes. In that hesitation, the political landscape shifted, leaving the world to decide if they were witnessing a victim of a partisan attack or a leader finally being asked to reconcile her private convictions with her public oath. It was the moment the world realized that while you can outrun your past for a long time, the truth has a way of waiting for you in a quiet room with the cameras rolling. The aftermath of those 14 minutes was less like a news cycle and more like a permanent stain. Within the hour, the digital world was on fire. The footage didn't just trend, it dominated, crossing over from political junkies to everyday Americans who usually ignored the noise of D.C. Millions watched the clip of Cruz holding that weathered photo of a 9/11 victim's mother, juxtaposed against Omar's silent, tear-streaked face. The internet became a court of public opinion where the evidence was undeniable, and for once, the partisan spin machines couldn't keep up with the raw speed of the viral truth. On the airwaves, the reaction was a seismic split. Conservative hosts hailed it as a masterclass in accountability, a clinical removal of the shield Omar had used for years. They played the Benjamins and hypnotized segments on a loop, framing it as the moment the Democratic Party's internal struggle with anti-Semitism was laid bare for all to see. Meanwhile, across the dial, defenders tried to cast the interrogation as a targeted hit job, calling it a cruel interrogation of a refugee woman. But the defense felt hollow to many viewers because the facts weren't manufactured. They were hers. Even moderate voices in the media found themselves unable to ignore the pattern Cruz had stitched together, noting that the questions asked were the ones she had avoided for a lifetime. Inside the halls of Congress, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of friction. Omar's allies in the squad circled the wagons, issuing fiery statements about racism and the weaponization of hate. But the wider Democratic Party seemed to be backing away into the shadows. Moderate members, especially those from districts where 9/11 still felt like yesterday, stayed silent, refusing to tether their political futures to her sinking ship. A quiet panic began to set in among leadership as internal polling showed her numbers cratering, not just among Republicans, but among the very independents they needed to hold on to power. Months later, the echoes of that day still haven't faded. Nicholas Harros Jr. still keeps that screenshot of the hearing on his desk. A small comfort that someone finally said the names of the lost in the face of those who would diminish them. Omar still walks the halls of the Capitol, still tweets, and still holds her rallies. But the air around her has changed. She is no longer just a pioneer or a provocateur. She is a woman defined by the answers she refused to give. Ted Cruz, when asked if he felt he had been too aggressive in that wood-paneled room, simply pointed to the record, knowing that once the mask is pulled back, it can never quite be fitted the same way again. Some people do more than something. They leave a trail of words that eventually becomes a path they can no longer escape. As the seasons turned, the fallout transitioned from a temporary explosion to a permanent feature of the political landscape. In the quiet suburbs of Minnesota, the shift was most visible not in shouting matches, but in the long, thoughtful pauses at kitchen tables. A once impenetrable wall of support began to show hairline fractures as voters who had championed a refugee's rise to power struggled to reconcile her story with the cold transcripts Cruz had laid out. The primary challenger who emerged wasn't a firebrand, but a soft-spoken moderate who focused on a singular, devastating theme: the difference between representing a movement and representing a community. Behind the scenes in Washington, the squad found their influence hitting a ceiling made of their own rhetoric. Legislative doors that were once cracked open by curiosity were now firmly bolted, as colleagues feared the optics of standing too close to a fire that refused to go out. The Democratic leadership, ever the students of survival, began a subtle but systematic distancing, moving Omar further from the microphones and the high-profile assignments. They had learned a bitter lesson in that Senate room. A victim narrative only works until the evidence suggests you are the one holding the gavel. The Jewish community, meanwhile, experienced a profound and painful awakening that transcended partisan lines. For many, the hearing served as a definitive end to the era of benefit-of-the-doubt politics. Synagogues and community centers held forums not just on the threat of the far right, but on the creeping normalization of ancient tropes within the halls of their own government. The question Cruz had asked, the one about Israel's right to exist, became a litmus test that echoed in every town hall and every donation appeal, turning a theoretical debate into a visceral demand for clarity. Today, when the name Ilhan Omar is mentioned, it no longer conjures just a singular image of a glass ceiling breaker in a burgundy hijab. It brings forth the ghost of that 14-minute cross-examination, the color-coded charts of lobbyists, and the haunting silence that followed a question about the moral equivalence of terrorists. She remains a symbol, but now she is a divided one, a hero to a narrowing base, and a warning to a widening public. The hearing didn't just change her career. It recalibrated the tolerance of a nation, proving that even in a world of spin, there are still some words you can't take back, and some silences that speak louder than any speech. Accountability is a slow-burning fire, and once it catches, there isn't enough rhetoric in the world to put out the heat of the truth. The legacy of that day eventually settled into the history books as a case study in the power of the record. For Ted Cruz, the hearing became a signature moment, a proof of concept that the most effective way to challenge a narrative isn't with a louder shout, but with a deeper file. He continued to walk the halls of the Senate with the same measured stride. But there was a new weight to his presence, the reputation of a man who could turn a standard committee meeting into a reckoning. He had shown that in a digital age where everything is recorded, the past isn't just behind us. It's waiting in the wings for its cue. For Omar, the world became a smaller, more defensive place. The soaring speeches that once drew adoring crowds now faced a constant, skeptical undertow from the back of the room. Every time she took a stand on foreign policy, a shadow followed her to the podium. The shadow of a woman who wouldn't say yes to a democracy's right to live. Her political life became a series of gates, each one guarded by the ghost of a tweet or the memory of a 9/11 victim's son. She discovered that while you can win an election with a base, you can only lead a country with the trust of the middle, and that trust had evaporated in the heat of a single afternoon. Even within the progressive movement, a quiet evolution began to take hold. Younger activists started to realize that the armor of identity politics wasn't impenetrable against the sharp edge of specific, documented facts. The Omar effect became a cautionary tale whispered in the offices of new candidates. Be careful what you post, be careful what you minimize, and never assume the public will forget the difference between a tragedy and something that just happened. The hearing had stripped away the glamour of the rebellion, leaving behind the heavy, unglamorous responsibility of being held to one's own word. Years later, the video of the exchange still circulates, a digital ghost that haunts every search result and every biography. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous weapon in Washington isn't a secret or a lie, but a simple, well-timed mirror. The marble walls of the Senate have seen countless debates, but few where the silence of the witness told a more vivid story than the speech of the questioner. History is a relentless editor, and it eventually cuts away everything but the moments where we are forced to show the world exactly who we are. As time moved forward, the geography of the American political soul seemed to reshape itself around the memories of that confrontation. The hearing didn't just fade into a footnote, it became a permanent landmark, a place where people returned to study the anatomy of a collapse. For the families of 9/11, that day in the Senate provided a rare, late-coming sense of justice. Not the kind found in a courtroom, but the kind found in the simple public refusal to let a tragedy be sanitized. They saw that while the world might move on, the truth remains a stubborn, unmoving thing that refuses to be rebranded. In the quiet corridors of power, the long-term impact was a chilling of the casual rhetoric that had once flowed so freely. Members of Congress began to look at their own digital footprints with a new, panicked scrutiny, realizing that the Omar precedent meant the immunity of the aesthetic was over. The shield of being a pioneer had been shattered by the hammer of the archives. The lesson was clear. You can be a symbol of the future, but if your past is built on the tropes of the past, the two will eventually collide with the force of a high-speed wreck. Omar herself became a figure of a different sort of history, a warning of what happens when the desire to be a revolutionary outweighs the duty to be a representative. She continued to win her seat, bolstered by a core that viewed any critique as a confirmation of their own worldview, but her voice lost its resonance in the rooms where the real work of the nation was done. She moved through the Capitol like a ghost of a movement that had peaked in that Senate chamber, forever tethered to the 14 minutes that had redefined her not by what she stood for, but by what she refused to denounce. The final verdict wasn't delivered by a judge or a committee, but by the collective memory of a nation that watched a woman choose silence over a simple yes. The footage remains on the servers, a digital monument to the day the music stopped, and the witness was asked to finally account for the lyrics. The most enduring stories aren't the ones we tell about ourselves, but the ones the world writes when we finally run out of things to say. Ultimately, the story of that day became a quiet reminder of the permanence of a person's public soul. Long after the headlines had been replaced by the next crisis, the video remained, a digital ghost that appeared every time a student searched for the history of the 2020s or a voter looked for the truth behind a campaign slogan. It became the gold standard for accountability, a moment where the invisible strings of political branding were cut away to reveal the person underneath. It proved that in the grand theater of American democracy, the most powerful performance is simply the truth, unadorned and unapologetic. For the people who lived through it, the hearing wasn't just about a senator and a congresswoman. It was about the resilience of American memory. It was about the fact that even in an era of tribalism and deep fakes, a photograph of a mother who died on a bright September morning still has the power to stop a room. It was about the reality that the words we whisper in the shadows will eventually be shouted from the rooftops, and that the only real defense against a record is a life lived with nothing to hide. As the years continue to pull us away from that afternoon in the Senate, the lesson only grows sharper. We are living in an age where the past is never truly dead, and the receipts are never truly lost. Every leader who steps into that bright, unforgiving light now knows that they are not just being measured by the speech they are giving today, but by every word they have ever let slip into the world. You can rewrite your future as many times as you want, but the ink of the past is permanent, and eventually everyone has to read it out loud. As the dust finally settled on that era of American politics, the Senate hearing stood as a bridge between the way things were and the way they would forever be. It wasn't just a win for a senator or a loss for a congresswoman. It was the day the digital age finally caught up with the human heart. The encounter served as a permanent reminder that in a world of infinite data, the most valuable currency is still a simple, honest answer. It taught a new generation of leaders that while identity can be a shield, it can never be a substitute for integrity. The image of that quiet room, the blue folders, the flickering screens, and the heavy silence, became a touchstone for those who believe that words must mean something. It proved that even when the world feels like it's spinning out of control, there are still lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. The families of the fallen, the survivors of old hates, and the citizens who just wanted to believe in their country again found a strange kind of peace in that record. They saw that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be heard. It just needs to be spoken in a room where no one is allowed to leave. Today, the footage is more than just a political clip. It is a mirror held up to the face of leadership. It stands as a testament to the fact that power is a temporary loan, and the interest is paid in the currency of public trust. As new faces take their seats at those same witness tables, they look at the empty chair where a reputation once sat and vanished, and they choose their words with a newfound gravity. In the end, the loudest sound in Washington wasn't the gavel hitting the wood. but the quiet click of a folder closing on a story that had finally run out of pages. As the narrative of that day settled into the archives, it took on the weight of a definitive political parable, a moment where the theater of the Capitol met the unyielding reality of the record. For the public, the exchange became a benchmark for accountability, a reminder that while rhetoric can be fluid, the history we create with our own words is concrete. The video remained a staple of digital discourse, not just as a partisan trophy, but as a lesson in the permanence of a public profile. In the years that followed, the ripple effects were felt in every town hall and campaign office across the country. The Omar Cruz dynamic became a shorthand for the collision between New Age political branding and traditional forensic scrutiny. It changed the way aspiring leaders approached their own histories, instilling a newfound respect for the trail of digital breadcrumbs that every modern life leaves behind. The hearing had effectively raised the cost of casual commentary, turning every tweet and every offhand remark into a potential witness in the court of future opinion. Ultimately, the story of that Senate room is less about a single confrontation and more about the endurance of American memory. It proved that even in an era defined by rapid-fire news and short attention spans, some questions about loyalty, about history, and about the value of human life never lose their sharpness. As the participants eventually moved on to different battles and new roles, the record of those 14 minutes stayed behind, a quiet, flickering monument in the corner of the internet. The truth has no expiration date, and it waits patiently for those who think they have outpaced it to finally slow down and look in the mirror. The long-term memory of the hearing eventually crystallized into a cultural touchstone, a moment where the fast-moving currents of social media crashed into the immovable rock of historical accountability. It became the definitive evidence that in the 21st century, a public figure's past is never truly behind them. It is simply archived, waiting for the right person to hit play. For the students of political science and the watchers of C-SPAN, the exchange was a masterclass in the power of the receipt, proving that a well-placed quote is more devastating than any scripted insult. As Omar's career continued, the hearing functioned as an invisible tether, keeping her from drifting too far into the mainstream without the weight of her own contradictions dragging behind her. The squad's influence, while loud, began to feel more like a walled garden, impenetrable to outsiders, but increasingly isolated from the levers of actual power. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, quietly internalized the lesson, shifting toward candidates who could navigate the complexities of identity without the baggage of documented tropes. It was a silent, strategic pivot away from a brand of politics that had proven itself too volatile for the national stage. For the American public, the 14-minute video became a digital monument to the idea that some things remain sacred. It reaffirmed that 9/11 is not a partisan talking point, but a deep, shared wound that refuses to be dismissed as something that just happened. It reminded a weary electorate that beneath the slogans and the flags, there is a fundamental expectation that those who lead must believe in the moral worth of the nation they serve. The hearing didn't just expose a pattern of speech, it exposed the distance between a leader who seeks to build and one who seeks to dismantle. Years later, when the names of the participants are mentioned in passing, the mind instantly returns to that wood-paneled room, the flickering screen, and the heavy, unanswered questions. The legacy of the interrogation isn't found in a law or a vote, but in the collective realization that a person's character is the sum of everything they've said when they thought no one was keeping score. The most powerful weapon in the world isn't a secret or a sword, but the simple, unvarnished truth of a person's own words coming back home to roost. As the final echoes of that Senate session faded into history, the event took on the quality of a ghost story told in the hallways of power. It became the moment that defined the end of the era of the untouchable activist, proving that no amount of social media followers can protect a person from the weight of their own history. The files Cruz laid out didn't just contain paper. They contained a mirror. And for the first time, the entire country saw what happens when the curated image of a revolutionary meets the cold, hard reality of the facts. The ripple effect eventually reached the very heart of the American education system, where the exchange was studied not for its politics, but for its truth. Students watched the footage to understand how a single sentence can bridge decades of history, and how a refusal to answer a simple question can be louder than 1,000 speeches. The 9/11 families found a permanent place in the record, their grief no longer a footnote, but a central pillar of the conversation about what it means to be an American leader. It was a restoration of the idea that some events are too heavy to be lightened by rhetoric. For the woman at the center of the storm, the world became a series of closed doors and quiet rooms. She remained in the public eye, but the sparkle of the newcomer had been replaced by the weary defensiveness of someone who knows the evidence is always just one click away. The hearing had stripped her of the ability to be a victim, leaving her only with the responsibility of her own choices. It was a lonely kind of fame, built on the foundation of the things she wouldn't say and the truths she couldn't face. The Senate Judiciary Room still stands, its marble floors and heavy desks unchanged, but it carries a different energy now. It is the place where the music stopped, where the slogans failed, and where the past finally caught up with the present in front of the whole world. It is a reminder that, in the end, we are all just a collection of the words we have spoken, and eventually, the bill for those words always comes due. The past is never truly finished with us. It is just waiting for the right moment to walk back into the room and ask us to name it. The chapter of that hearing finally closed, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding shift in the machinery of governance. By early 2026, the political landscape had transformed into something far more jagged. For Ilhan Omar, the fallout from that Senate confrontation wasn't just a memory. It was a constant companion in a House of Representatives that had grown increasingly hostile. By late 2025, the pressure had culminated in a razor-thin House vote to censure her once again, this time stripping her of her seats on the Education and Budget committees. It was the final legislative brick in a wall that had been building since she first sat across from Ted Cruz, a physical manifestation of the accountability he had demanded. The streets of Minneapolis mirrored the tension of the hearing room. Despite the national firestorm, Omar had secured her fourth term in 2024, proving that her base remained a fortress even as the rest of the country's opinion soured. But by the winter of 2026, the stakes had turned deadly. The rhetoric that had simmered for years finally boiled over when Omar was physically attacked at a town hall, an event that sent shockwaves through the Capitol and briefly united bitter enemies in a chorus of condemnation. The "some people did something" era had evolved into a "something is happening to us" reality, where the line between political theater and physical danger had completely dissolved. Ted Cruz, meanwhile, watched the unfolding chaos from a distance, his mission seemingly accomplished. He didn't need to repeat his questions. The silence Omar had offered in response to Israel's right to exist had become the definitive answer for millions of Americans. As the 119th Congress grappled with a government shutdown and a nationwide crackdown on sanctuary cities, the ghost of that 2024 hearing haunted every debate. The record had become a weaponized archive, used by both sides to justify a level of partisan warfare that had moved far beyond tweets and into the very fabric of American law. Today, the footage of that afternoon exists as a digital time capsule of the moment the old rules of engagement died. It is no longer just a clip of a hearing. It is the origin story of a deeper, more permanent divide in the American soul. The marble of the Senate Judiciary Room remains indifferent, but the people who walk its halls do so with a new understanding. In the age of the permanent record, there is no such thing as a private opinion, and there is no such thing as a forgotten word. The years that followed turned that Senate room into a legendary site of political excavation, where the fossils of a career were unearthed for all to see. It became the moment the progressive movement's rapid ascent hit a wall of cold, documented reality. By the time the next election cycle rolled around, the Omar effect was no longer a theory but a tactical map used by every challenger in the country. The strategy was simple. Don't argue with the person. Argue with the transcript. The record had become an unblinking eye that refused to let the past stay buried. In the hallways of the House, the atmosphere around the squad grew increasingly quiet. The once raucous press conferences were replaced by guarded statements and a strategic retreat into the safe harbors of their own districts. They had discovered that while you can build a platform on the outrage of the present, you can only sustain it if you can survive the scrutiny of the past. Omar remained a fixture, a survivor of 1,000 political storms, but the fire that had once burned so brightly had been replaced by the weary, flickering light of a long-term defense. For the wider American public, the 2024 hearing became a milestone in the struggle for the national narrative. It was the day the country was forced to decide if words still mattered or if everything was merely a tool for the next power play. The 9/11 families, the Jewish community, and the millions of voters who watched the footage saw a glimpse of a different kind of politics. One where the person behind the microphone is finally asked to reconcile their rhetoric with their responsibility. It was a brief, shining moment of clarity in a world that had become increasingly blurred by spin. As the participants eventually age out of the spotlight and the files are moved to the National Archives, the video will remain. It is a digital monument to the idea that truth is a patient hunter, and that no matter how fast you run or how high you climb, the things you've said will always be there, waiting to ask you one last question. The most enduring form of justice isn't found in a gavel or a vote, but in the simple, quiet moment when the world finally looks you in the eye and asks for the truth. As the current calendar turns to February 2026, the story of Ilhan Omar and Ted Cruz has moved from a viral Senate hearing into a high-stakes legislative reality. The two remain locked in a symbolic struggle for the direction of American policy. But the battlefield has shifted to committees and the violent friction of a nation in transition. In September 2025, the House of Representatives passed House Resolution 713, a measure led by Republicans to officially censure Omar and strip her of her seats on the Committee on Education and the Workforce and the Committee on the Budget. It was a final, cold echo of the accountability Cruz had called for, marking her as a member without the traditional levers of influence. The physical world outside the Capitol has become just as volatile as the debates within it. In late January 2026, the tension surrounding Omar's record erupted at a town hall in Minneapolis, where she was sprayed with a syringe containing a strong-smelling liquid. The incident, which led to an immediate arrest and federal charges, briefly silenced the partisan bickering as leaders from both parties, including many of the Democrats who had previously distanced themselves, condemned the assault. Yet, the attack only deepened the resolve of her base. Despite the censure and the scandals, Omar had secured her fourth term in November 2024, decisively defeating her Republican opponent after surviving a bruising primary challenge that focused on her missteps. Ted Cruz has maintained his position as a primary architect of the opposition. In early 2026, he leveraged his chairmanship of the Senate Commerce Committee to honor victims of aviation tragedies, framing himself as the guardian of American lives while continuing to contrast his record with Omar's. The rivalry has even bled into his own party. Cruz was recently heard in leaked recordings offering sharp critiques of President Trump and Vice President Vance, suggesting that the Omar precedent of digital accountability has made even the most powerful Republicans wary of their own archives. The receipts that Cruz once used against Omar are now being collected by his own donors, proving that the culture of the record is an equal opportunity judge. The legacy of that afternoon in the Senate now serves as a template for a new era of politics, one where identity is no longer a shield, and history is never truly settled. Omar remains a ranking member on subcommittees and a champion for her district, but she walks a path defined by the questions she didn't answer and the censure that followed. As the 2026 midterm elections approach, the footage of that 14-minute confrontation remains the most-watched political archive in the country, a digital monument to the day the music stopped and the witness was asked to finally account for the lyrics. The past is no longer a prologue. It is a permanent part of the present. And in Washington, the ink never truly dries. The chapter on that Senate hearing finally closed, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding shift in the machinery of American power. By the start of 2026, the political landscape had transformed into a jagged, unforgiving terrain where the ghosts of the past were being summoned into the light of the present. For Ilhan Omar, the fallout from her confrontation with Ted Cruz was no longer just a digital memory. It had become a legislative weight. In September 2025, the House introduced Resolution 713, a measure to officially censure her and strip her of her seats on the Budget and Education Committees. It was the final, cold echo of the accountability Cruz had demanded in that wood-paneled room. The physical world outside the Capitol had become just as volatile as the debates within it. In late January 2026, the tension surrounding Omar's record erupted during a town hall in Minneapolis when she was rushed on stage and sprayed with a syringe. The incident briefly silenced the partisan bickering as leaders from both sides condemned the assault, yet the attack only deepened the resolve of her fortress-like base. Despite the censures, the scandals, and the relentless scrutiny, Omar had secured her path to a fifth term in the 2024 elections, proving that in her district she remained a symbol of resistance that no archive could easily dismantle. Ted Cruz, meanwhile, continued to act as the primary architect of the opposition, his voice growing sharper as the 2026 midterms approached. In December 2025, he publicly outlined potential criminal charges against Omar, ranging from tax violations to the long-whispered marriage fraud allegations, suggesting that for some, deportation was the only fitting conclusion to her story. He leaned into his role as a guardian of the record, even as he faced his own challenges from leaked recordings and internal party friction. The Omar Cruz dynamic had evolved into a permanent feature of the national soul, a symbolic war between those who view history as a weapon and those who view it as a shield. Today, the footage of that afternoon in the Senate exists as a digital time capsule of the moment the old rules of engagement died. It is the origin story of a deeper, more permanent divide where identity is no longer an armor and the past is never truly settled. Omar remains a ranking member in her subcommittees and a champion for her causes, but she walks a path permanently marked by the questions she didn't answer and the receipts that refuse to fade. As the country moves deeper into 2026, the legacy of those 14 minutes stands as a monument to the idea that in the age of the infinite archive, the truth is a patient hunter. History is the only judge that never sleeps, and eventually, it calls every witness back to the stand for one final unblinking look at the record.